There we go. Order. Welcome to this morning's meeting of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. Today we are holding our fifth and final session on protecting built heritage, and we've heard lots of important evidence over 4 previous sessions. We've had also almost 120 written submissions, all of which have been really useful and shown how important built heritage is to communities right across our country. So today, to bring us to a magnificent conclusion, we will put all this evidence that we've been gathering to the government, and we are joined by Baroness Twycross, who is the Minister for Museums, Heritage and Gambling, but clearly not all at the same time, Fazima, Osborn, the Deputy Director of Heritage at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and Mark Chivers, who's the Government Chief Property Officer, the Office of Government Property Cabinet Office. That's a long job title. Before we begin, I suppose I should point out that our witnesses come with very different responsibilities. DCMS through the Minister and Ms Osborn lead on national heritage policy and support for the sector, whereas Mr Chivers represents the Cabinet Office's role in overseeing and managing the government estate. Bringing those views together, we think, will help us fully understand where the challenges and opportunities lie. So you're all very welcome today. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we start, I need to remind members to declare any interest at the point that they ask their questions. I'm going to kick this off with you, Baroness Twycross, please. The government recently announced £1.5 billion funding over 5 years for cultural venues. Now that included £230 million specifically for heritage. One of the issues that we keep hearing about through our evidence sessions is getting access to that money, how difficult it is to get access to that money, how patchy it is, and how often that money just gets swallowed up very, very quickly and leaving so many organisations unable to access it. What are you doing to ensure that the at-risk heritage sites, especially those in areas without much local support or resources, can access and benefit from this funding?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the invitation to appear in front of you today. One of the ways that DCMS is making sure that funding goes to the places that need it most is by ensuring that we look at double disadvantage. So we're identifying places of particular need, both in terms of multiple deprivation, but also in terms of social capital and places that may have low levels of social capital. In some ways, that also means that they're probably least equipped to apply for funding. So I've spoken personally to the Architectural Heritage Fund and Historic England, who administer these funds for us, in terms of making sure that it's made as straightforward as possible and that those applying for the funding get as much support as possible to access the funds they need.
And then, then when it comes to actually distributing the money, I mean, how will you do that for sort of geographically? Have you got sort of geographical targets, or it's done on, as you say, on indices of multiple deprivation? I mean, you know,
we're using the indices of multiple deprivation, but also the Community Needs Index. The actual measures of how we'll do it are still being worked through. So we're still working through with the arms length bodies how this will work in practice, because we're also clear that we actually, when you're looking at heritage, we do need to take into account the value of the heritage, whether that's historic value or the community value locally. But what we'll be measuring, as well as hopefully we'll get improved heritage assets as a result of this significant funding, but we'll be looking for evidence that it contributes to key objectives of the department. So, for example, improved economic growth or improved community cohesion.
So another one of the issues that keeps coming back up with all these sort of government pots of cash is the short-term nature of them, the unpredictability, the fact that, you know, organisations don't know whether they're going to be able to bank on receiving funding in the years ahead. They can't plan for the future. They say they just want certainty when it comes to government funding. What is this fund doing to give them certainty? What more broadly are you as a minister doing to give them certainty over their futures?
There's certainty over the spending review period in terms of the funding, and that was at the heart of what the Secretary of State announced in terms of the overall pot of funding. Clearly there is an application process to go through, but we hope that this funding will ensure that the sector is clear what capital funding there will be for the next few years, and not least this will help with planning the skills pipeline, which is also an issue.
What's the end date on this funding? How long does it go up to?
It's 4 or 5 years. It's the end of the Parliament, the spending review.
Yeah, next 4 years. Okay, and then the other issue, following the government's announcements of these funds, the other issue that keeps coming back is when it's particularly for small organisations, getting the expertise to be able to make those applications, figuring out actually what's needed and how to make it happen is one of the biggest obstacles. How are you considering the need for the kind of early stage development or grants, particularly for smaller organisations that are struggling to write these major applications?
The lottery fund, the Heritage Lottery Fund, actually looks at guidance for volunteers. I think one of the things we need to recognise is that a lot of these organisations that are applying for funding are actually volunteer driven or volunteer led, or they're led by community groups that maybe don't have a huge amount of professional capacity. So that resilience building of those organisations can be part of the funding people can get. And then with the Architectural Heritage Fund, who I believe you spoke to in an earlier session, I've been really impressed by the way that they work very closely with local communities in terms of walking them through the process and making sure that they're well equipped to apply for the public funding that's available.
Is there money available to kind of do the early stage work? I mean, as you say, so many of these organisations rely on the goodwill of volunteers and the huge dedication of volunteers. But is there a potential that there's a pot of cash that people can use to be able to do that early work?
There is funding for feasibility studies. I might hand over to Fazima to talk you through that.
That's fine. That's exactly the sort of thing that the Architectural Heritage Fund will do. This year they delivered quite a lot of project viability grants as well as early project development grant funding, and that is exactly the sort of thing that they will do for our future funds in relation to Heritage Revival Fund. Historic England also, who are delivering the Heritage at Risk Fund and also the new Places of Worship Renewal Fund, will also offer practical hands-on support for local volunteers with dedicated project officers and step-by-step guidance.
That sounds quite confusing to me. So you've announced the Architectural Heritage Fund, Historic England Fund, Lottery Heritage Fund, and all the different pots of money that they're juggling. If I suddenly became a volunteer steward of a historic building, where would I start if I don't come with any of this knowledge? I mean, is there sort of a one-stop shop, or an advisory hub, a place where I could look to see where I could access the expertise and the money to be able to support my work?
The regional offices of Historic England give a huge amount of advice, and my understanding is that would also include signposting to other pots of money.
And is that kind of somewhere signposted on the government website somewhere?
It's definitely signposted on Historic England website. We can check that it's sufficiently signposted. I haven't actually gone through that route of checking that myself.
It would be interesting, I think, just to see, from the point of view of a volunteer,
we can definitely check that.
How you get signposted to all the potential access of different funds. Very good. Thank you very much.
I might just say there is the government grant funder, so all of our grants should be listed on there as the kind of first one-stop shop. But I think Historic England's expertise is really useful at then actually guiding those small volunteer organisations to a bit more on the specifics of those funds.
Very good. Thank you very much. Let's move to Rupa, please.
Thanks. Hi. I just wanted to ask about the listed place of worship grant scheme. So it was a huge relief from the sector when it was announced that it's going to be replaced by the son of the fund, the Places of Worship Renewal Fund. How's the new fund going to work? What are the differences?
So the key difference is that it's going to be targeted. So I think that the VAT model we had previously was a pretty blunt tool. So the new fund, which will have 90 million over the next 4 years, will be targeted at areas of double disadvantage, as I referred to earlier. We are working through the criteria and how that will work in practice, because I'm also clear that if you have a postcode, that's not necessarily reflecting where the place of worship is undertaking its community work. So we're looking at how it will support community cohesion as well. So we're working with Historic England and the wider sector on the specifics, but I think that we will be focusing on areas that might not have actually been able to raise the capital up front, which obviously in order to access the VAT relief, people had to actually have quite a significant amount of capital to undertake the works.
Yeah, I mean, I found it interesting. You said you're looking at multiple deprivation, and it does say areas of greatest need. Can I make a plea that you go a bit more granular than the Fair Funding Review? So one of the two boroughs I represent is Hammersmith and Fulham, which came off quite badly on that, because the south of the borough is Fulham and Yuppies, but the extreme north of the borough, the two wards I represent, if you look at the poverty heat map, they're dark red. And in fact, all my £2 million houses are not in Hammersmith and Fulham, they're in Ealing Borough. That's a net gain. So if you can look at it by ward data or something a bit more blunt than whole borough, I would be grateful.
I think we will. No, I appreciate that, and that's why when we've been discussing how we will make the assessment, I also asked for people to look at where the place of worship, the listed place of worship served, as well as what its actual postcode was.
Okay, no, that would be good. Yeah. And shout out to St Cat's Church on the A40. It's a 60s building, so it's not your traditional ecclesiastical, but, you know, those kind of things are difficult to heat. They need a lot of repairs, the windows falling out, that kind of thing. And you mentioned that these things are volunteer-driven. How do you have concrete plans to avoid creating additional bureaucracy for the lovely ladies who run St Cat's Church and other places of worship? Because, you know, the quagmire of forms and bureaucracy.
One of the early conversations I had with Historic England and the new chief execs of Historic England was exactly about how we make sure that moving from the VAT model, which is obviously relatively straightforward, to a sort of more targeted model didn't increase the burden of volunteers. So they've committed to actually working very closely with volunteers to make sure that they walk them through the process.
That would be very welcome. I mean, sort of mosques, synagogues, temples, gurdwaras, all those things, they've provided playgroups, warm spaces, soup kitchens. One of mine was a vaccination centre, so it's more than just the Alpha course that these things do. But we've heard that since the fund was announced, there's some quite shocking figures that repair schemes are going to go up. And in fact, I think the National Churches Trust have calculated, I mean, they've actually given a figure to savings to the NHS. They claim it's 8.4 billion a year. Places of worship save the NHS. But repair schemes are going to go up by 20% because the VAT relief has gone for places of worship. They claim it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. What comment do you have on that?
So I think that we did a review, so we did an assessment of the previous scheme, and remarkably 80% of the respondents said that they would have undertaken the repairs anyway, so it might have taken a little bit longer, although in the case of, I think it was 15% said that they would have done the repairs at exactly the same time, in exactly the same way. So we're clear that actually targeting the resources potentially towards places where they struggle to raise the capital means that actually we're using it in a much more effective way for public money in terms of making sure that we focus on areas where they might not have been able to undertake the work. I mean, clearly we will see some people who won't be able to get the 20% back, but for some places of worship, we would assume and anticipate that they would get much more significant amounts of money than they've been able to under the VAT relief scheme.
Okay, so it's not the picture that's being painted.
I probably don't agree 100% with NCT on their portrayal of where we're moving to, but we will work with them and with other organisations to make sure the scheme is as straightforward as possible, and that churches and other listed places of worship recognise that we're doing what we can to help the church congregations and the place of worship more generally, we're really clear that they do really incredibly valuable work and have a much greater community benefit than the faith communities themselves as well, which is also significant.
And lastly, do you have any sort of steps you're taking to stop listed places of worship? By nature, they're often very old and rambling type. Well, I mean, we're in an old rambling building ourselves now. The R&R proposals came out last week. Any steps to stop them falling into disrepair and having them fit for the future?
I think the first step is obviously having the targeted fund, but we've got other pots of money that they can also apply for. So the Heritage Fund remains a significant funder of repairs, and there's also a huge number of people who give philanthropic, I can't say the word, but anyway, they give philanthropic money towards place of worship, and clearly the Church of England itself also puts significant amounts of money into church buildings, as do other faith communities.
Okay, thanks. Once it all settles, if there's anomalies, I may be right.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Baroness Twycross, could I encourage you just to be explicit? So I think, the stated purpose of the previous scheme, the listed place of worship grant, was expressly about heritage conservation, historic buildings. And the letter I have from you with your signature on, it talks about maintaining the fabric of some of our nation's most historic and beautiful buildings. The new scheme talks about areas or places of most need. Now, obviously, the two can coincide. You can have, and do have, I'm sure, in many places, historic, heritage assets that are also in places of great need. But they are two different primary objectives. Can you just be explicit? Has the purpose of the new fund is different from the purpose of the old fund? Is that correct?
The purpose of the new fund is around heritage buildings, so it is heritage funding, but we are looking at where those funds are needed most. That might meaning.
So you can define needed most in lots of ways. How do we mean it in this context?
So I think that it is about whether the people who are trying to fundraise for their building need it most, whether the building needs it most from a heritage perspective. So I think we've not quite worked through all the criteria. So if I land too firmly on one thing, then I don't want to come back and say, actually, we've tweaked it and done it another way. But I think we are looking as a department in terms of our funding, going for that double deprivation, double disadvantage measure, which will actually also be part of the factoring in for this new scheme.
But that does then lead. And I'm not saying I'm not passing any judgment whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just trying to understand. That does mean that you will lead on the criteria. So this fund is a lot smaller than the old fund. I mean, you said the main difference was something else, but the main difference is it's smaller, right, than the fund that was. So you're going to have to cut out a lot of projects that otherwise would have been covered. And I think from what you're saying is that in that prioritisation, what will get cut out is heritage buildings, some of our nation's most historic and beautiful, but that don't happen to be in areas that show up high on the list of indices of whatever it is, multiple indices of multiple deprivation.
Yeah. I think I will bring in Fazima because she's clearly keen to come in, but I think one of the key things in the decision making, and it is the same amount of headline money as it has been for the past financial year.
But not before that. Sorry, we're not comparing it to us, we're comparing it to the scheme as was.
No, that's true. But one of the reasons we kept it was because we do recognise the importance of the sort of listed places of worship generally. But I think that the key thing for me was in the evaluation where 80% of people said they would have done the work anyway. And when I visited St Michael de Belfry in York, they had established that they had found the funding from somewhere else. So I think that for me it's about when you've got scarce resources, and I think it's clear that we inherited quite difficult economic circumstances, we need to establish how we can best use those limited resources. And for me, using those for schemes that would have taken place anyway didn't actually feel like the best use of public money.
In evaluating individual projects, you don't know the answer to that question. You can ask, project managers can answer that question after the event. Would you have done this anyway? They're not going to say in the application, we will do this anyway. I think you'll be applying criteria like the demographics of the postcode rather than whether they would have done it anyway. So my question is, in having reduced the fund so dramatically as you have, cut it so dramatically, is it the case that what's going to fall out of favour will be heritage buildings that don't happen to be in deprived areas? I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, but I'm just trying to understand that sort of clearly.
I might say, as the Minister said, we're still developing the finer detail of the criteria. We've talked about areas of double deprivation, not just the indices of multiple deprivation, but also the community needs index. So I think we're talking about weighting the criteria towards those places, but this is about heritage funding, so that will include thinking about the condition of the asset and the community use of the asset as well. And I don't think that means that we're saying no other places can apply unless you're in those areas, but the weighting of the fund itself may mean that that is less likely.
And you're working on that weighting, that formula at the moment?
Yes.
And when do you anticipate publishing the criteria?
We've committed to have the new criteria clear by the beginning of the next financial year.
Yeah, we'd like to give places the opportunity to understand how the scheme will work, and then further detail in terms of opening of application processes maybe a bit later.
But we're working with the faith organisations as well on that.
The current scheme reimburses VAT on repairs to churches and other religious buildings, listed religious buildings, and that's going to be ending at the end of this financial year, and being replaced with the grant scheme.
Yeah.
So that actually means that churches and other religious buildings will be paying tax on their repairs for the first time in many, many years. What was the thinking behind that?
It was around the fact that VAT is a very blunt tool, and with the limited pot of money, we were clear that we needed to make sure we were targeting it as effectively as possible.
What sort of message do you think that sends out to, all those volunteers, all the custodians of our shared heritage who are sort of working so hard to maintain heritage buildings in their own communities right across the country? I mean, it's quite it feels to me quite a negative attitude to just say, well, it's not about the building anymore, it's about where the building is located.
I think as Fazima outlined, there will still be scope for buildings to apply. Some people will get significantly more funding. I don't underestimate the effort it takes for people to raise funding for projects in place of worship. My own parents have been sort of active in their local church raising money, and I've sort of know it takes a huge amount of effort, and it's a lot of stress for the people involved who aren't doing it professionally. So I'm not underestimating that, but I would like to think that the people involved in fundraising would understand the rationale of us making sure that with limited resources we're targeting it to places and projects that need it most.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about that a bit later on, but it just feels that VAT, if you're building something new, you don't pay it, and suddenly in order to try and breathe new life back into a valued older building, you are paying VAT. It just feels like a really bad message to be sending out. Let's move on to Natasha.
Very much, Chair. I'm going to just move on now to housing and the role that these sorts of sites can play in helping the government reach its ambitions to, tackle the housing crisis. So what government funding is available to help achieve the government's wider plans to increase housing supply by enabling the reuse of historic assets?
Want to start, Fazima, or do you want?
So who do you want to start on this?
Who would be best, John?
In terms of the government property portfolio, or just generally?
Just that, so we're going to talk about the one public estate. We're going to talk about that as well. So just sort of what the government owns, what...
One public estate is definitely me,
Yeah.
more than happy, so we can start there and sort of evolve also. So for the panel, and Mr. Hines asked a question to my colleagues from MOJ and MOD last time, your last panel. One public estate has been going for 13 years and is a programme that we work with the local government association, and really what we do is we catalyse schemes that are bringing together local partners and central government partners and catalysing regeneration or schemes. And it's been a hugely successful programme with hundreds of millions of capital receipts, new houses. So we're up at, from memory, and I can check the numbers in a moment, 80,000 houses have come out of it, and so on. It's small scale, so it's not on the scale of Homes England schemes, so it's much more little developments, albeit some of them run to hundreds of houses, so it's an important contribution. So there are lots of examples of where we have provided some money either for remediation, spent some MHCLG money for remediation, or maybe for some master planning, which has then led to developments coming out of the ground which have often, in particular related to heritage assets, the dual purpose of providing a sustainable future for the heritage asset and also creating housing. And needless to say, we were expecting the question, so we've trawled back through the records of how many schemes we have, and I think we've had 41 schemes which have included heritage assets and have led to maintenance and a sustainable future for those heritage assets, and housing and other commercial development coming out of it.
When you're looking at the the whole estate and you're thinking about strategically how you're going to protect and reuse these sites, is housing a priority in those discussions? Is that the third?
So I start from the point of view, and you heard it a little bit from the property directors that you talked to last time. I start from the perspective that if we've got a building for government use, then the first purpose is to get a productive and efficient use for government for that building. In some instances, there's no longer a beneficial use for the government, and it moves through to a disposal, or it moves through to a development scheme or whatever. So the departments will look, as part of that disposal process, whether there are options around development or sale to a developer to bring forward housing development and other uses.
Sorry, just so I understand, so your kind of process of thinking is, can this be used, is it necessary to keep it for government use? Because obviously once you sell off a piece of estate, you can't really get it back. And then the next step in that is, do we look at disposal? But are you giving greater weight to projects that have housing as a focus, or is it just sort of in the mix of...
It's in the mix, but it will be picked up through the Green Book valuation, which assesses the social value of the scheme. So there will be it will be weighted through that route, but I can't tell you that there's a 5% weighting towards housing or whatever else.
Then I think the kind of kick-off question I had was more broadly, sort of, if you're someone, it's not a publicly owned building, but it's a heritage building, what kind of pots of funding are available to developers or groups locally that want to repurpose a historic building for housing?
I think heritage is an incredible opportunity for us in relation to new housing, and I think Historic England think that there's a potential for up to 670,000 new homes, which is quite remarkable. I think in terms of the funding available, some of that's through VAT, and I know we're coming on to VAT in due course, But I think that the key thing is, if it is the other thing we're doing is consulting on changes to the planning system to make sure it's easier for that reuse to take place.
You said there's a potential for 670,000 homes.
Yeah, that's what
just by repurposing heritage sites.
Yeah, so it would be things like disused mills or repurposing disused mills and so forth. I mean, it's a remarkably high figure.
Given that figure, given the the 1.5 million target, given that figure, given where these locations are, because they'll be in communities that probably very much need these properties. Do you think enough priority is being given to repurposing these sites for housing? Do you think there's enough kind of weight? Do you think there's enough focus in government to repurpose these sites?
We're having regular conversations with MHCLG from DCMS in terms of the planning process and making sure that we remove some of the barriers that people identify. So I think there's a sense that if you've got a historic building, it's more complex than a new build. Obviously, you're sort of not starting from scratch in the same way. So we've been looking at how we can make sure that we change the planning system to balance conserving our heritage and allowing development to happen, including for housing and infrastructure. And as the Heritage Minister, I'm very clear that actually if you reuse a historic building that isn't in use, that's actually the best way to preserve it for future generations. And not only that, people really appreciate living in heritage buildings, and so there's a value for the communities and for those people who can then live in accommodation that has sort of got a higher sort of welfare benefit, because actually having historic buildings and heritage buildings in your local area is seen as a really positive thing by local communities, but generally only if it's in good repair.
I might just talk a little bit about the new local plans that local authorities will be required to deliver, and that should have a section which has a positive strategy for the historic environment. So it will do things like identify potential sites, heritage sites for development, talk about areas that might be in decay, and also what considerations might need to be given to enable those sites to be reused for housing. That should give developers and applicants a bit more certainty, a bit more clarity, and also helps them to de-risk their projects.
And just to kind of pick up off that, the point around developers, what are we doing to ensure that people aren't just buying these sites and letting them decay? Because I think there's nothing worse for a community to see a heritage site bought and left to rot into the ground. So what action is being taken to, if we've got 670,000 homes sitting out there and developers just sitting land banking in these beautiful buildings and letting them disintegrate, what action can be taken to prevent that?
I give an example. Just a tiny point on the previous, and then I'll give an example of where I think it's being done well. So just on the previous OPE or general development, in my experience from very much a property angle, then the heritage building is often the anchor for a development, and that's both in terms of providing the cultural aspect and the sort of centre of it, but also it can be a way of a developer getting additional housing by maintaining the building and providing a life to the building. So it's not just the core asset, the core mill, but there's some development around that. As you sort of might expect, I get to go on some really good site visits. And one of the brilliant site visits I went on to last year was a Homes England development, and they were doing it through a developer, of the nuclear bunker in Nottingham. So Cold War nuclear bunker, complete concrete or whatever. And the way they'd structured that deal was that was surrounded by a big field, and the housing was given consent, and there was going to be housing surrounding it, where for the developer that was where the return was. But what they had put in place, what Homes England had put in place, was a deal that structured the release of the housing planning consent dependent on the amount of refurbishment and reuse of the nuclear bunker. And that's the sort of thing that you can do to tie two things together.
That prevents so that the developer doesn't make their money back until they've done the hard graft.
Precisely.
Did you?
If I might come in, I think one of the things that we're hearing is that developers want certainty, they want clarity, they want consistency of decision making, and so the biggest change that we're making is consulting on the National Planning Policy Framework, which is a change from the current framework. And if I might just exemplify a couple of things that will be really important for them. So bringing an empty or underused building back to life is now to be considered as an important public benefit to be considered in the planning decisions. The other one, which we may come on to, is making heritage buildings energy efficient, is also an important public benefit, and that should be given substantial weight. And then the other one I would highlight is just to say that we're removing the test for whether optimum viable use has been found, which should make it easier then for planners to consider viable options so long as there is not significant harm to heritage. And all of those things collectively should mean that both developers, when they're looking at sites, and applicants have clarity, and so do local decision makers.
Thank you, Natasha. I mean, I'll be with you in 1 second, but the issue, when are we actually going to see that making a difference on the ground? I'll give you an example. In my constituency, we've got a site called Fort Gilkicker, which you may be aware of, that has had successive owners because it's a complex historic site, as the name suggests, military site formerly, and was literally just lying there rotting at public expense, but local kids clambering all over it at risk of life and limb, graffiti, the whole thing just rotting into the ground. So someone comes along, buys it with the view of turning it into a housing development and restoring it to its former glory. And at that point, so many layers of bureaucracy get thrown in on top, whether it's Natural England making them sort of try and find newts and start rehousing them, the local authority who clearly don't have the expertise to really opine on some of these planning issues, just keep putting in more and more and more bars that they have to jump over, whether it's Historic England or whoever else with all their extra requirements as well. It becomes financially so punitive that it's almost impossible to deliver it in a way that's going to have any benefits for those who've invested in the first place. Your investors effectively are doing it out of the goodness of their heart rather than because there's any commercial advantage. When's that going to change?
It's something that's being consulted on currently in terms of the consultation on changes to the National Planning Policy Framework. I'm clear that that needs to change and it does need to shift in order to remove some of those barriers. And the conversations I've been having with MHCLG have been about sort of making sure it's no longer seen as a disadvantage to be trying to reuse a heritage site, that it's actually seen as an advantage and something that they can embrace because we are making it more straightforward. I mean, the hoops people have to jump through currently are clearly a disincentive. Potentially sitting on 670,000 new homes. I mean, that number is eye-watering. It is eye-watering. I kept having to check that it wasn't 67,000 when I was doing my prep.
So you have the answer to. I mean, the government is staring down the barrel of red-faced embarrassment at the fact that they're not going to be able to deliver on the housing numbers that they promised. They promised the country that they will. 1.5 million new houses. They said, we're nowhere near going to be able to deliver on that. You've got the secret. You're holding the key to the door to unlock the government's huge embarrassment in this. So why aren't you just standing there waving a flag going, come on, everyone throw your resources here, this is how we do it? It just feels like we're consulting on this and we're asking about this and we might be changing the policy down the road. If I were you, I'd be like, come on guys, this is it. I can save your red faces. Let's do this.
I'm confident that we're going to make changes that make this much easier. I appreciate that it would be popular to say we're just going to tear up the red the red tape, but I think we need to get this right, because this is about making sure we reuse our heritage buildings in an appropriate way, and we need to go through the consultation first. I appreciate that it would be very popular to just say we'll just chuck it all down the drain, but I think that we want to get this right. We want these properties to be developed in a way that is sympathetic to their heritage and are good places for people to live. And we're confident that by the changes that will come through the consultation, we can make a really valuable contribution towards that goal of the housing targets.
When will we see this start to bring fruition? When will we suddenly see homes delivered in some of our valued listed buildings?
We're already seeing homes delivered in them. I think, do you have time to frame for the consultation?
The consultation closes in early March, and the government will consider the responses. As soon as the new framework is published, that should start to influence those decision making, and really what we're encouraging is that will be encouragement for the local planning authorities to make different decisions, and Historic England have a really good pre-application service, which means that they can work really closely with developers at early stages to work on designs, as well as practical application of what might be needed for the condition of the site, and that means whilst it's going through planning, that allows speed and de-risking of the projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem you're going to have is that local authorities don't have access to that sort of expertise or decision-making power.
So can I just say on that point about local authorities, because the government is also investing, I think, £48 million in upskilling the local planning authorities. So by the end of this Parliament, we're anticipating that there will be 1,400 additional planning officers at local authorities. Obviously, from a heritage perspective, I hope that some of those people will have those conservation and heritage skills. But I think we do recognise that actually we need to put funding in where it's needed to make sure that the local planning authorities have the skills and resources they need.
Thank you. Back to Natasha, then Vicky.
Very quickly, you just said that the skilling up and I used to be a local councillor, so I understand how terrible planning departments can be. They're decimated. They've got hiding them in there. So skilling up those people, getting them in, that's really great. But you said you hope that they'd have those skills. Could we not just ensure that they did? If we are now onlining a whole bunch of new generation of planners, there's 670,000 homes sitting out there. Could we ensure that every council has a planner that has that sort of expertise? Could we put that into
I think in some cases it might be enough for them to share somebody with that resource, but what we're not doing is dictating to local authorities exactly how they should focus that money. They'll need to work through their own priorities, and in some cases they might already have those skills. So for us to dictate how that funding, which is MHCLG money, would potentially not actually result in the outcomes we're looking for. I think we're not dictating to local planning authorities how they should spend that funding.
You said earlier about having conversations with MHCLG in terms of things that you might want to be able to, repurpose these buildings. What specific things have you been asking for in those conversations?
It's actually mainly been around the planning process. So I'm very mindful, as I've been sitting here, that I haven't actually had a direct conversation with the Housing Minister. I'll be honest about that. And it's probably on my list of things that I'll want to go and do after this. But it's been around the planning process more generally, in terms of making sure we adjust it so we're still recognising the importance and how we preserve heritage, but actually removing some of the what seems like unnecessary bureaucracy. For example, you've got a situation in which I think it's 92% of listing building consent applications are approved. If that is the case, then it feels like there's a lot of unnecessary bureaucracy going into doing processes just because we've always done them, rather than actually saying what is it we need to make sure we're mindful of when we're looking at development of heritage. And what can we do to make things more streamlined? So some of the conversations have been around sort of local listed building consent orders and so forth, which are currently being used increasingly by local planning authorities, but actually there's only a handful, and compared to the overall number of local planning authorities, a handful of councils that are using that seems very low.
You said you haven't met with the Housing Minister yet?
No, not directly.
You have met with the Planning Minister?
But I've met with the Planning Minister.
Okay. I mean, I should think they'd be rolling out the red carpet if you turn up at their offices telling them that you can offer them 670,000 houses.
I'd like to think they're already aware of this, which is why we're able to have the conversations on planning.
Yeah, I think the conversations that we've been having have been really trying to get the right outcomes into the consultation, and I think we would say that we wouldn't underestimate that the changes that we're making will have significant impact. They do need to happen, and they do need to then be used on the ground, but that is the significant way in which we've been
the outcome of that potential is the reason for those conversations we've been having about planning.
Okay, Jeff.
Thanks. Can I go back to the issue of VAT? Because we've got this situation where if you're building new homes, you don't pay VAT, you've got VAT reliefs and exemptions. But for these 670,000 potential homes in potentially beautiful buildings with all that embedded carbon, if you want to reuse and repair those, you have to pay VAT. And it just seems to make no sense.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and lots of people have said that lots of people have told us that reforming the VAT rules would make a massive difference to repurposing heritage assets. So, I suppose, firstly, do you agree it would make a big difference and it makes no sense? And secondly, it's a Treasury decision. Are you pressing the Treasury to reform the VAT rules on this?
So I think I'm open to looking at the evidence on this, but there are a number of schemes where there is much lower VAT. For example, if a building has been disused for 2 years or vacant for 2 years or more, you can have 5% VAT, and if you're converting from a commercial to residential property, that's 5% VAT as well. So there are some VAT incentives in place. But our focus has really been around changing the planning system to prioritise sensitive change. I think that I'd need to have a bit more evidence to take to the Treasury to make the case for that.
Okay, I think we can probably provide with the evidence. I mean, I remember the MOD coming in saying that it would make a huge difference, and there's, in fact, I think, is it not in that? Yeah, so. There's a suggestion if there was a rebate scheme for heritage buildings, it would cost about 6 million, which isn't a lot of money in government terms. It generate benefits in the region of 14 million. So maybe we can help.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd be keen to see what the findings of the committee are on that point. What I would say is obviously that the Chancellor is responsible for tax policy, and it is something that has been discussed over the years with officials in the Treasury. But I do think that there's other reasons why that property isn't being unlocked, and we've been focusing very clearly on the planning reasons why there might be issues in terms of releasing that property and getting it reused, which is actually what people have been telling me is one of the biggest constraints.
Okay, I mean that's good and that's fine, but I want us to deliver these 1.5 million new homes as well. And it seems that this is another lever to do that. Have Cabinet Office had any conversations on that issue?
Not it's a issue I think for the Treasury ultimately, as you've directly said.
But where other departments can see an advantage in a policy change, they can make the case, can't they? I would encourage both departments to make the case in this situation. Are there any other kind of incentives that you can use instead of either financial or other incentives to promote repair and reuse and conversion into new homes?
I think in terms of the turning properties into new homes, I think it is. It has been largely around the changes to the planning system. I think that in some cases where you get projects that combine other community uses, there would be funding from the Heritage Fund or the Architectural Heritage Fund around that sort of community use. So I think, but I'm not aware of any particular pots of funding specifically around this, not from DCMS anyway.
No, but MHCLG do have the Pride in Place Fund, which is a significant amount of funding over 10 years, and many hundreds of places are eligible for that. Whilst that is for local people to decide how they might want to use it, they could choose to use some of that funding towards restoring and renovating heritage buildings.
I think it can be used for that. I don't think Pride of Place Fund can be used for that sort of housing project.
Housing,
yeah.
Right.
No.
Okay. Apologies.
I think we can go.
Because if it could, the amount that we've got in my constituency would be used for exactly that purpose.
Yeah. So what we can do is go away and just double check if we're aware in the department about any funds that could be used for that, and we can write to the committee on that.
You haven't met with the housing minister. Have you met with the Treasury minister to talk about the potential for removing the VAT on?
No, because we've been focusing on the planning aspects. Officials have been engaging over a longer period of time on that.
Thank you. Sorry, Joe.
No, I was just. That's fine. I've finished. Those figures I quoted were from historic houses, and they were about publicly accessible historic buildings. But lots of people have told us that VAT reform would make a big difference.
Yeah, I read quite a lot of the transcripts and aware that a lot of people have raised that.
Yeah, loads of people have said it's an important change.
We're going to be quite busy, Minister. We're beginning to put your diary up for you already with all these bilateral meetings that you're going to be needing to have. Sorry about that. Bio.
Thank you, Chip. Morning, all. So, Mark, this is a question for yourself. We've heard from sort of like various government departments about just not knowing the condition of their sort of heritage assets and the expenditure in terms of the upkeep and maintenance. They don't know, effectively. So, how do you manage the sort of oversight of heritage assets across government departments?
It's a good question. Let me sort of start at the top in the sense that you've heard about MHCLG set the legislation for a lot of this through the planning laws. Then what we do, so my role is that I provide the strategic and professional leadership across the property function across the departments. And we have one of a number of standards. So there is a property functional standard, and similarly there is a commercial standard and a people standard and so on. So we're responsible for the property standard, which lays out how government departments should look after, maintain, provide a resilient estate. And within that, there is an element which is specifically about heritage, which comes into the government property strategy as part of our smaller, better, greener estate. So it's laid out within the functions, and then what happens is we require each of the departments to have something called a strategic asset management plan. So the departments are required to provide a strategic asset management plan each year for their estate. And to Dame Caroline's point earlier on in the conversation, then we're requiring a much greater forward look so that it's not just a year position, it's not just a 3-year position. We're asking for longer time periods, look forward for the maintenance and the care of their estate.
Per department?
Per department. So at the moment, this year we've had 30 strategic asset management plans returned, which is all of the departments and then some of the key arm's length bodies as well. So you heard from the Government Property Agency, which is an arm's length body of the Cabinet Office, and they, for example, produce a strategic asset management plan. We are work in progress on strategic asset management plans, without a doubt. So the property function as a whole is relatively young. So it was started 2017, 2018. I'm the first person as Government Chief Property Officer, apart from an interim, who is a property professional in that role. And what we're trying to do is increase the professionality, the capability of those across the property function, the data, and indeed the sort of due diligence. So again, going back to Dame Caroline's different point, then when we look at disposals, for example, we're encouraging more and more due diligence into who disposals are going to be sold to, so that actually there's a credible plan for that asset to be taken forward rather than land banked or left to wither on the vine. So there is a structure which starts in legislation, goes into the functional standard, and then each year I have probably 2 bilaterals with those departments to hold them to account for the delivery of their strategic asset management plan.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned earlier about sort of the productive sort of and efficient use of the disposal process. Yeah. And so you mentioned that you're professionalising the departments, in fact, sort of how they look at property assets. So does that extend to sort of like partners that can help sort of dispose of assets or to repurpose assets or to bring assets quickly to a disposal process?
By partners, are you talking sort of commercial agents, or are you talking community, or what's the direction? Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All of those, historic England as well, really. Yeah. To help sort of realise the potential of the asset as such. How proactive are we in looking at all those different sort of avenues to support that goal?
So the process within the largely commercial estate for government core buildings is that when it's deemed to be fit for disposal, if it can't be used anymore, the first question that is asked is, can it be used elsewhere in government? And so can a different department use it, or can it be put together with another asset in order to create something different and better for the partners in that? If disposal is the only outcome and is the chosen outcome, then each department will have a responsibility to maximise the Green Book value. And I mentioned Green Book already, and I say it rather than maximise the proceeds, because the Green Book value includes the social value as well. So the burden or the onus or the responsibility of the department disposing of the asset then becomes to create the highest social value and ensure as part of that, particularly for heritage assets, that the building will have a conservation and a sustainable future as part of that disposed asset. So there's a responsibility, as I've said, around due diligence to make sure that the acquirer is going to not let it wither on the vine, to use the previous analogy I used, but actually to create a sustainable future for the building. And that going back to the conversation we had about one public estate, there are a number of examples there, and there's a particular example around Waltham Forest and the public building in Waltham Forest, and this is an example, one of many, but actually the scheme there led to the refurbishment and reuse of the Grade 2 listed Waltham Forest Council, and forgive me, I probably said the wrong terminology, but building, but that also allowed more than 400 houses to be built in the land that was released around it. So what I'm trying to portray by that is that this isn't just the let's get the pound notes into the tills. There's a longer term prospect about how we can generate the best solution for the local community.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah. You almost brought a tear to my eye, a happy tear, because Waltham Forest, that site was where I got married, actually, as well. So there you go.
I genuinely didn't know, but if I had, I would have definitely.
That was good. You're good. I suppose this sort of brings me back to sort of like bureaucratic sort of obstacles and security considerations around ownership rules. We met with the MOD sort of a few weeks ago, and some of the challenges they had was around sort of like legislation, inconsistent sort of local authority sort of interpretations. And I know we spoke a little bit about the skills gap within councils as well, lack of conservation officers, those kind of things. So what are you doing? What is your department doing to try and help redress those problems?
So one of the things that I'm trying to do for the 7,000 people who declare to be part of the property function across civil service is one of my key assurance roles is assuring the resourcing, the capacity and the capability exist to deliver the services. My remit doesn't extend into the capacity and capability within local authorities because my role looks over the central government estate rather than across the whole estate. But I completely accept and recognise the comment around a lot of hollowing out of capacity and capability within local authorities. So we'll do what we can from the central government point of view, and if there's a particular scheme, then I'm sure those colleagues across central government will lean in to try and support as they can into local authorities.
Thank you. I mean, that's really important because when we were talking to the MOD, for example, what we see sometimes is sort of particular buildings, particular bits of real estate that are no longer useful, that they've forward-looking, there's no potential sort of use for it. And it just seems like a process, only a process is required in terms of sort of bringing it back into community use or just changing some of the sort of the land sort of boundaries, if you like, in order to sort of hive it off so that it's able to be disposed of quickly. So I suppose this goes back to my point around partners and proactivity. Any support there would be certainly sort of needed and required.
Well, we'll certainly lean into that, and I think there is probably something for us to work with DCMS to actually point out and create some stories around the successful examples of this, because it's not always successful working with a series of partners, and it's very difficult, but there are examples of where it's really worked well. So I think across the commercial, across the housing sector, across the regeneration sector, where those partnerships, collaborations have worked well, then we ought to be shouting about them a bit more loudly than we probably are.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Barry. Can I just ask, so it feels to me that quite a lot of the different government departments just don't seem to have a clue what's going on with some of the heritage assets or keep very strong records. You say that there is this strategic asset management plan that they all have to send back, but when we spoke to the MOJ and the MOD, a lot of them actually didn't keep a very close eye on the condition of their heritage assets. Does that surprise you?
So the MOJ Strategic Asset Management Plan does call out its heritage assets and some of the particular points. So I think Ricky McSeveny, the property director who you met last time, called out Hewell Grange, which is disposal that's going through at the moment in Tewkesbury. That was called out in terms of the Strategic Asset Management Plan. I think the MOD is more difficult. I haven't yet had a strategic asset management plan from the MOD, where I'm talking to them next week, literally to ask them when are we going to get it, when are we going to be able to interrogate it, to be able to hold you to account. So the functional standard, as I've laid out, is clear that there's a requirement to do it. If the departments aren't doing it, then I need to hold them to account and escalate that as appropriate.
So what would be a satisfactory return from your perspective? So I think about, I'm sorry to keep harping back on my own constituency, but it's my own point of reference, right? So I think when the guy from the MOD was here, we spoke about HMS Sultan, which has got 2 listed forts within the perimeter of the estate, one of which, Fort Rowner, is currently used to house people's caravans. And no money is spent on any form of maintenance or restoration. It's just being allowed to rot in a way that if any of us owned it, we would not be permitted to allow it to do so. You can understand why, because all the money that the MOD have is being spent on sort of security and defence. They don't have the sort of resources to be stewards of historic buildings, but there's no incentive for them to dispose of them either. In fact, it's almost the opposite. It's the incentive is for them to just allow these buildings to rot. I mean, we were pushed back on this phrase of managed decline, but it's the phrase that we hear time and time again when it comes to the stewardship of these kind of assets. This policy of managed decline. So if this strategic asset management plan came back and they said Fort Rowner, for example, is in a state of managed decline, would that be acceptable? Would that get a tick in the box, or what would you be able to say about that?
So the functional standard and indeed the government property strategy maintains or dictates the custodianship of the heritage assets. So I don't accept that managed decline is acceptable. And we will be challenging where we see instances of not sufficient maintenance to be. Of course, we'll be challenging on where we deemed that there isn't sufficient maintenance. One of the things that is happening in parallel is there's much greater focus on the condition of the government estate. And the backlog maintenance, not for the heritage assets, but across the rest of the estate. And we're linking in with Treasury much more than we have before in terms of SR settlements that were referred to earlier, to actually give the release of money into departments on the basis of sustainable plans for the repair and maintenance of those buildings. So I think we're starting to provide the tools where there's much greater linkage between the money coming through, not being spent on something else, but actually being spent on the things that it needs to be spent on.
What about disposal? I mean, is there any appetite for supporting it? I mean, the One Public Estates, as you say, hugely successful, but it doesn't feel like the MOD or MOJ have been encouraged to think creatively about how they might potentially use. I mean, clearly some of these buildings are right in the middle of a piece of
behind the wire.
Yeah, but I mean, some of them are sort of right on the edge, or just and would easily be disposed of. What can be done to incentivise that?
So we have a target across government of disposals, which we've exceeded. So disposals are happening. I can't provide you the data with what the disposals proceeds are from heritage assets. I don't know whether the data will allow us to look at that, but we can try and do it. But it's back to the point around the strategic asset management plans. So there should be a property asset management for each property in the estate. And if that is that there is no surplus, there is no beneficial use for that building going forward, then that takes it down the path of disposal. And what we'll try and do is hold the department to account of where it is in that disposal process.
Okay, and finally, the Director of Property at the MOJ said he had no relationship with Historic England, he'd never met them. How regularly do you meet with Historic England?
So I met Claudia and Emma for the first time in May last year at a sort of regeneration conference, and to be fair to them, they came and introduced themselves to me rather than the other way around. I then followed up and met them in June or July, so I went across to their offices in Cannon Street, and we've been coordinating since. So they're just about to in the next few months, will be publishing the Heritage at Risk statement, so we'll be supporting with that like we have done in the past, chasing, to your point earlier, chasing the errant departments who haven't provided returns, so providing a bit of extra power to the elbow. And what I've said to Claudia and Emma is that increasingly going forward we will tie them into the property leaders network, because I bring all the property leaders together. And this coming May, at the big regeneration property investment public sector conference in Leeds, which is called UK Reef, Historic England will be part of the government tent. So they'll be doing presentations and speeches in the tent, along with Ministry of Justice and with the other government departments.
Yeah.
So we're at the start of tying them in much more closely than they have been.
I think that Claudia and Emma are excellent, and it would
I
be useful.
agree.
They are very good,
I
and
agree.
they are actually in the process of, if they haven't already met the MOJ, following the session they were at, they definitely arranged to meet them afterwards.
Yeah,
so.
very good. Let's move to Damien, please.
Thank you very much. Question to Mark into Fazima. So we've talked a bit about housing targets. Is there a target, either numeric or sort of generic, either from the perspective of the government estate overall, or from the perspective of heritage assets, regardless of whether they're public sector or not, for hotel accommodation or the development of other travel and tourism assets?
Not that I know of for government.
Even in central London, which is where...
You've seen the Old War Office and Admiralty.
I know a lot
and
has
so on.
happened. I know we're still expecting Petty France to go and
Indeed,
so on.
yeah, Mark
but there's still an
mentioned that.
awful lot of very high-value prime real estate owned by HMG, which could be a hotel.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any sort of drive to... I mean, obviously, you want to get best value for sale, subject to the Green Book. But is there any kind of drive specifically to develop our capacity and capability for tourism?
Not specifically. Going back to my previous answer, when we dispose of something, it's because it's not needed by government for use, and the outcome, the use of that building going forward as a property development or as a straight swap into another use will be dictated by the developer and the value case, the social value case for that building. So I think what you are seeing with Admiralty Arch and with the Old War Office and indeed 102 Petty France is just the highest value usage coming through in those particular locations.
Happens to be a hotel accommodation. Yeah. Fazima, from the point of view of the wider sort of heritage asset register, is there any kind of particular move to try and use that as a way to develop tourism and travel?
I don't think we have any specific targets around hotels in particular. I think we talked previously about the planning system allowing the right developments to come forward and for local communities to also have a voice in what they would like to see happen in their local communities, but I'm not aware of any for hotels.
And Minister, may I ask you about skills? And you talked earlier about planning for the skills pipeline. Obviously, the government's making a lot of changes. The apprenticeship levy has changed as the growth and skills levy. Government's going to reduce the minimum length and the minimum content of apprenticeships. It's removing the independent body that oversees apprenticeship standards. Do you anticipate those things being of help to this sector?
I think that we do have an issue with skills in relation to heritage and the built environment generally. I think that one of the things that's been raised with me most as I've been going around doing visits is the sort of aging ageing nature of the people with the skills. Sometimes they are sole traders, they don't necessarily have the capacity to take on an apprentice. I'm also clear that it's not always the right model to have a shorter apprenticeship for a sort of heritage skill, but I think that within the scope of some of the work around the construction boot camps, the skills around joinery and construction are very relevant to the pipeline we need for heritage. One of the first things I did as Heritage Minister was have a skills roundtable with the sector. There's some incredible examples of innovation within the sector. So you've got sort of centres of excellence, for example, at York Minster, and I think there's one at St Paul's as well, and I've also visited Salisbury. So the various different sector organisations have their own schemes, and the Church of England sites have others. What I didn't see, and what I've been working with the sector to work with them to address the skills challenge, is around discussing how you get a bit of join up around that, because we're also clear that if you get if you don't have the skills to adapt or refurbish heritage buildings, you can actually make the situation worse than it was to start with. So I think we want to get this right. The thing that's encouraged me most has been the willingness of sector organisations like Historic England and the National Trust and Historic Royal Palaces to work together on this. So looking at how you could have an apprenticeship that could work across several different sites or 7 different organisations, for example, and we're following it up with...
That is possible, of course, already.
Yes.
You can have apprenticeships across multiple
yes,
organisations.
but it hasn't happened to a significant extent in this area. So I think that the other thing I've done is discussed heritage skills with the Skills Minister, raising some of the issues that the sector has highlighted to me, and she was very positive about sort of how we can work with Skills England to make sure this is addressed.
Did they mention, and did you then mention to Baroness Smith, any worries about the removal of public funding for level 7 apprenticeships for people aged 22 or above? Things like heritage consultant, conservation architect, or the archaeology specialist masters?
Not actually been raised to me directly, no.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
And just one other on that. Witnesses have told us that the levy doesn't cover things like wages or essential costs like travel and PPE and tools, which obviously are a huge thing for apprentices. I mean, is there anything more you can do to ensure the levy works for not only the sort of micro businesses that potentially could take on, as you say, it's an ageing, very skilled workforce, and actually drives up the cost of restoring heritage buildings because of these people are thin on the ground and have incredibly excellent skills. Is there more to do to ensure that the levy works for employers wanting to take on apprentices?
I'm sure there is, and it's something we can pick up again after this session. I think that one of the most interesting visits I've had was actually talking to apprentices about why they took on the role, how they heard about it. And actually, I think there's more we can do to actually highlight in the first place. So there's other issues as well, and I think one of the biggest issues is people's awareness of this type of skilled work as an opportunity for a career for the future. And I think there's far more that needs to be done to actually highlight both to people who could provide the apprenticeships, but also to young people coming through the system about the type of opportunities that are available, because for some of the apprentices it's almost like they've happened upon it rather than actually sort of being aware of it in the first place.
And is that more that could be done with Skills England then, to highlight the heritage skills?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I mean,
How would they do that?
Sorry?
How would they do that?
How would they do what? Sorry.
So if you say Skills England may have a role in making these opportunities aware, how would you anticipate them doing
I
that?
think through not sure, I might need to hand over to Fazima for the exact name of the working group they've got on it, but there is a group that is looking at, is it working group on the construction skills? Historic England is part of the engagement around that. So I think it would be around ensuring that our sector organisations have a voice at the table so they can highlight the issues and be part of the shared solution on it.
Which table is that, sorry?
The
you say a seat at the table.
There's a working group. I mean, and a part of the discussions. Sorry, I can't remember what the name of the working group is. Okay. But there's a there's a construction board which is looking at the sort of broader construction skills. And Historic England is definitely engaged with that.
I was trying to get at something a bit lower level, actually. So I mean, it's a long-term issue trying to put in front of young people some of these, the range of opportunities. I'm sorry, I thought you were saying that Skills England could play a role in making these things more, making young people more aware of some of these varied routes. But then you went on to talk about a sector table, which is, I think, possibly slightly different.
Yes.
But is there a way that you know of that career routes in the heritage sector can be made more available, more known to young people?
I mean, I think it's broader issues around how young people access apprenticeships, and I think obviously this week is apprenticeship week, so it's a good point to be discussing it. I think it goes from everything from what careers advice is available in a field where there's been quite a lot of lack of careers advice over the past decade or so, which is being addressed. But it's also about when young people go to a historic royal palace or they have a school visit, what is it they're learning from that visit to that historic site? Is it just about history, or is it about the range of careers that are open to them? And when I've spoken to the royal palaces, for example, they're very open to making sure that young people are aware of the actual skills that are involved in maintaining a site, whether that's from sort of how you deal with sort of project management generally, through to actually sort of exposing them to somebody who's actually doing the stonemasonry.
And so Skills England will be involved in that?
They will now.
They will now, but I think that it's... So I think, but it's across the piece, isn't it? And every single level needs to be making sure that young people are aware of the careers available to them.
Just to be clear, have you ever had a conversation with Skills England where you sort of suggest that heritage skills are embedded within the local skills improvement plan and the regional workforce strategy?
I think Historic England are engaged with Skills England as a government advisor.
I think they are.
They definitely are.
Okay. And those they would be pushing on those two things.
I'll double check they are, but they should be. Yeah.
Right, good, thank you.
Dame Caroline, can I just add, sorry to interrupt, so you may well have seen, but DFE announced yesterday 13,000 apprenticeships and T-skills in construction skills. Now, what I don't know is what proportion or whether there's any specific heritage route in as part of that, but we'll pick up the conversation around that. So just fantastic news to pick up new apprentices into the gap that is construction skills more generally.
And it would be lovely if heritage was
exactly right.
They might have to add that to the list of people that the Heritage Minister is going to be visiting over the month ahead. Let's move on to Jeff.
Thanks. Can we talk about listed building consent briefly? So we've heard from a number of people about the delays and inconsistency in the process. So firstly, Cabinet Office. Is the Cabinet Office doing anything to accelerate listed building consent for public estate reuse?
So no. As you will know, the building consent goes through MHCLG, through planning local authorities, etc., etc. I have got an enormous amount of sympathy to something that Emma said when she came before you last time, which is actually it doesn't necessarily take more time, and especially if there's the pre-engagement with Historic England. So what I will be advocating, if one of the property teams ask me across government about getting listed building consent is that your first call is to Historic England to get the advice about how best to pursue this particular scheme.
Anything from DCMS on that particular topic?
Well, in terms of the government estate or generally?
Yeah, well, generally actually, in terms of
So
improving the processes.
I think I referred to this earlier. I think when you've got 92% of applications being approved, the system is clearly approving these, but there's an argument that actually too much is going through it. It feels too high to us, which is why we're looking at sort of the whole system. We want to see more examples of local planning authorities looking at the local listed building consent to make sure that they have potential for blanket permission. So, for example, I referred to the sort of handful of local planning authorities that have this, for example, for solar panels. I think Kensington Chelsea's got permission for solar panels to be added, or things like double glazing or heat pumps. So, but this isn't being used sufficiently currently, which is one of the reasons there's so many applications going through the system in the first place, which, if I'm honest, just seems a bit daft.
Yeah, so you're making those happen, are you?
Well, I think we're encouraging people to look at it as a way that they can facilitate sensible, sympathetic adaptations.
I would, if I can add some colour to that. So it is encouraging that local planning authorities are doing this. Just in the last year, there's been 3 new ones, which is great. But as the Minister said, they seem to be an underutilised tools. Historic England are looking at, well, what are the barriers to actually more use of this? If the evidence does show there are things that could be done more at the national level, that is something that we could be open to encourage more of those tools to be used.
Okay, thanks. We've also heard about what's been described as a postcode lottery, both in terms of interpretation of what needs to go through the processes, but also in terms of capacity to actually deliver these things. What actions nationally can we do to end the postcode lottery, to improve the capacity and the expertise and the consistency of the process?
So the capacity issue, apologies, I also jumped ahead earlier, is around the investment in the local planning authorities and making sure they've got the right skills, so £48 million towards this. We would hope that would improve it's intended to improve the quality and consistency of advice, but I think it's a fair challenge that at the moment the system isn't necessarily consistent either in terms of the speed at which these things are done or the consistency of the outcome.
You think it's mainly about investment rather than streamlining processes?
So I think the streamlining of the process is really important. If we can avoid some of those 92% of applications that needing to go through in the first place, it stands to reason that it should be more straightforward and quicker for people to get the permissions they need or don't necessarily need.
If I might add two things. The new Planning and Infrastructure Act also includes training for planning committees, and that should include training on the historic environment, so that should help with local decision making. But I think in terms of the Minister's sort of point around lots of applications going through the system, the statutory consultee review is also looking at where we can take out cases that are going through the system so that can allow Historic England to focus on the most complex of cases, and that is due to be responded shortly too.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's move on to Vicky, please.
So you were talking about energy efficiency and how important that was for planning, but in terms of retrofitting, kind of what are we doing to make it easier to retrofit in buildings to ensure that they can meet net zero targets without compromising heritage. And, what will you be doing in terms of supporting the skills development to help ensure that we achieve this? And how will you ensure that planning policy balances heritage in conservation with climate goals? And also, I think the other important bit that's been raised to us a lot on this is around the VAT in terms of retrofitting as well.
Shall I start with the specifics, maybe, on the changes that we talked about in terms of the reform to the National Planning Policy Framework is really important. That change for making historic buildings, heritage buildings, energy efficient, and that having substantial weight in the system should help with balancing making those retrofit changes happen with heritage. So that's really, really significant, I would say.
Absolutely, and I think that we estimate that we need about 100,000 additional workers to carry out the retrofitting generally to meet net zero targets, so it's not an inconsiderable task. A large part of that is coming through the work that DfE is doing in terms of the skills pipeline around construction. But I think that, as Fazima said, we also want planning that sort of says yes to some of this work. So we need a planning system that is permissive in terms of sensitive retrofitting, but also a workforce that can carry out the work safely, so that it doesn't sort of diminish the stock of heritage buildings, or specifically or individually. There's some really imaginative examples out there. So I visited York Minster, which is a UNESCO site, and they have managed to find a way that they could put solar panels on a refectory roof. You would not be able to tell that they were not the original type of tiles, but they've managed to do that in a way that's sensitive to the heritage environment. So I think part of the solution is also about sharing of best practice, and I think they're very innovative and have been very innovative in the way that they've addressed the need to have sensitive retrofitting and changes to the building, recognising the need to adapt to climate change, but also done it in a way that meets the quite stringent requirements of their custodianship of really valuable historic sites.
I think your points on heritage needing more creative things is really important. Yeah. And actually, in terms of the construction and the apprenticeships that are coming through, how much of an emphasis is making sure that they're trained in terms of the heritage and being able to get that right balance?
I think this is one of the things that we've been discussing with the sector in terms of what can we do, working with them in terms of making sure that we understand what the skills gap is, what pipeline is required, and then also how can we support them both sort of from a DCMS perspective, but in terms of that advocacy with DfE, in terms of making sure that we get apprenticeships that work for the heritage sector, where if you go to a palace, they're not going to let a sort of newly minted apprentice out on a sort of really irreplaceable tapestry, for example. But how do we actually make sure that we're replacing sort of the ageing workforce and actually learning from people whose skills are potentially dying out if we don't do something now?
If I might come in with a couple of examples of those qualifications that might help. So energy efficiency in older buildings is a level 3 qualification, so that is trying to embed those retrofitting skills so that they're not niche but they're part of industry standards, and also installation apprenticeships as well, making those much more mainstream for construction workers to deal with historic homes.
It's not niche because 20% of our built environment counts as historic built environment. So in that case, these skills shouldn't be seen as niche.
And then the point on the VAT, in particular referencing retrofitting, have representations been made to the Treasury on that?
It's not something I've raised particularly on that point.
I think just to speak on sort of officials, under the last government there was an energy efficiency review where there was some discussions, but as the Minister said, it's not one that we've had detail on recently.
Thanks, Vicky. Annalise?
Yeah, can I just come in on the back of Vicky's before I go to my question? So, before I was elected in 2024, I worked at Congress House, the TUC, and that building was built for the TUC and is historically and culturally significant and is a listed building. They are now having to sell the building because they can't afford the environmental upgrades. Organisation like that just can't upgrade it. So they're looking at moving out from a building that they were sort of curators of. It's for like the trade union movement, and like who knows what it will become. And I was just wondering your thoughts of places like this that will come, will have this issue going forward with the environmental upgrades, which are quite right for the sustainability of the buildings, but also have this effect of maybe those buildings just being, they're living, breathing buildings and maybe being used as for some corporate or hotel or whatever that is. So I was just interested in your thoughts on that living example of how this is having an effect.
Well, I think just from my perspective, I think it's really sad that the TUC is moving out of the building. I think we're clear that the best way to maintain heritage generally is to use it. In terms of the retrofitting cost for that specific site, I don't really have the answer on that, but I think that it is something that Historic England does give advice to organisations on that type of work on a regular basis. So if whoever takes it on after the TUC, I'd hope that they'd work very closely with Historic England to make sure both that the historic nature of the site is recognised and maintained in some way going forward, but also that they do it in the most sympathetic way when they're doing the retrofitting.
Yeah, I'm so upset about it.
Yeah, no, me too.
But I'll move on to my questions and we can continue with this. I really wanted to ask about buildings in terms of community and culture, so both community stewardship, but also about buildings that are culturally important but maybe don't tick the boxes in terms of getting listings, but have really real importance to people. So I guess the questions are to all of you really, but I'll start with DCMS. So what is your approach to strengthening community involvement in the care and ownership and future of local heritage sites? Do you want to start, or
I'm happy to start. I think that for us, our approach is very much about sort of community and how the community values the particular heritage asset. So I think we're getting better generally at recognising community buildings that contribute to our national stories, whether that's Brixton Market, or one of the things that came across my desk was the Crown Hotel in Birmingham, where Black Sabbath started their career, and I understand heavy metal originated, although I wasn't there at the time. And I think that it is right that listings reserved for buildings that have national interest, but there's a whole load of other ways that the significance of a building can be recognised, whether that's the Blue Plaque scheme, which has been extended to the whole country. And I think last year the UK's oldest lesbian social venue, the Gateways Club in Chelsea, received a Blue Plaque, or there's local listing which can also do that. But for me, the biggest way that the community value of heritage can be recognised is by reuse. So, for example, there's been a couple of unlisted properties in Grimsby that have been turned into an art centre. actually bringing part of the docks in Grimsby back into use in a way that it's been quite derelict. So it's kind of like, so what do you value, and how do you make sure that the community see its value? And I think you've had everything from the Heritage Action Zone scheme, which we're still learning the lessons from, through to sort of bespoke projects that sort of the Architectural Heritage Fund have worked with communities to make sure that they bring back derelict or part derelict buildings back into use, and actually as a result of that they can quite often get funding from other sources sort of further down the line to have greater redevelopment of the area. But I think there's nothing more depressing than seeing a heritage building in disrepair, and at the heart of what we're trying to do is make sure that communities can feel that they're valued by actually seeing some of these buildings come back into use.
And gives them a stake.
Yeah.
Mark, have you got anything to...
So just referring to the disposals guidance, and we've covered it a little bit already, but we lay out a disposals guidance when we're selling government buildings, and heritage is a particular part of that. But worth reiterating that assets don't have to be sold for the highest market value, and the point there is where there is a community value and a social value, that's absolutely taken into account. So the good news is that we're not just selling it to the person who's going to land bank it or anything else. The other thing...
Can you give any examples of where that's been successful?
I'll come back to you in terms of where we've sold for less than the market value, no problem whatsoever. The other thing that I would say, and this is from my pre-government life, so when I managed a number of heritage buildings, we looked at community usage for some of those, and there are... As been said by the committee, it's a hard gig for a community to take on a building, because you're not just thinking about the conversion cost, you have to think about the maintenance costs going forward, and the community business, enterprise, whatever, has to be sustainable in its own right to be able to support those ongoing payments, which will often be more than running a non-heritage building, and there's an extra burden on the business plan for that. So I think I'm under no illusion at how difficult it can be for communities to take it on, and I think our responsibility in committing a government property into a community use is to do the due diligence to without in any way being patronising, help them to help themselves to realise that they can take on the burden of responsibility.
So can I come back in on that? Because I think that quite often communities know what the value of their local heritage is and what they value. And a large part of where we're going from DCMS is obviously a different angle than Mark from the Cabinet Office. Is about empowering communities to protect the heritage that matters to them. And one of the most significant changes this government is making is around the community right to buy, which will give communities the first opportunity to buy assets of community value when they go up for sale, which includes doubling the time communities have to raise the funds, and it brings a wider range of assets in scope. So, but I can't underestimate the value of some of the arm's length bodies that we work with in terms of their engagement with local communities and supporting them where they don't necessarily have the skills from previous experience, but they have the passion about the area. So I've been particularly impressed, as I think I said earlier, by the Architectural Heritage Fund and other organisations, including Historic England, and the lottery also help with capacity building.
And what about what Mark was saying in terms of that support of maintaining and, you know, costs going up that maybe the community hadn't?
I think that's one of the things that the business planning process is one of the things that the Architectural Heritage Fund helps groups with. And I haven't just heard it from them. When I went to an event that they ran a few weeks ago, I heard it from people who'd actually benefited from their support, and they've also got some innovative funding models, albeit not with the government funding part of it, where they have a system where they lend money to projects. So it's quite a circular way of using the money they have to make sure that as many organisations and projects can work, can benefit from their support and advice.
And some organisations and academics, etc., who we've taken evidence from previously in this inquiry have talked about the idea of a safe harbour scheme or different things that are kind of like this, like the Music Venues Trust talked about the Own Our Venues initiative to protect at-risk buildings while communities plan for their futures. So just how you see that working.
Some of that would come under the community right to buy. The National Trust have discussed and sort of proposed in very loose terms the idea of a safe harbour. I think we're really interested to hear more from them about how that work in practice, but I think it shows the appetite from the sector in terms of looking at innovative ways that heritage can be protected.
Because we've had a lot of ideas around different ways that would work in different sectors, like the Diocese of Liverpool as well came up with something. Any other thoughts from the panel on that?
Everything that Baroness Twycross says is right. The ambition has to be for transferring into community to maximum social value, which is absolutely often the case, transferring it into the community, and indeed a plan for long-term stewardship. So I completely agree. Agree.
Thank you for that. My final question is about the volunteers, like the people that help, and we've been hearing that they are overstretched, burnt out, they're also lacking in skills, they're in aging volunteer base as well. So what's your strategy on that to support those volunteer-led organisations, prevent that burnout, and also how are you incentivising and getting out to like those of the future and encouraging the younger people to get involved and volunteer in these?
So from a sort of broader DCMS perspective in relation to volunteering, I think we've got a portal that is live or is going to go live about sort of making a work in progress, where it will be clearer what opportunities for volunteering there are. So that's sort of making sure that people can identify the volunteering activities. Our arm's length bodies offer quite a lot of guidance and support for volunteers, and I think that we've also got a focus around making sure that if it is a volunteer-led project or community-led project, which is obviously often the same thing, then we want to make the application process as helpful as possible. And I think that that's where the advice of some of our armed bodies comes in as well, in terms of demystifying the process, because if it's only possible for people to get through the sort of process if they've got experience in it or are doing the work professionally, then we're missing the point in terms of making sure that we're quite community-led and community-focused in our approach to heritage. So we're very clear with our armed bodies that we need to have processes that volunteers can find accessible, and I think that should help with some of the burnout. But I think it's really important that we recognise the incredible work our volunteers do, and they outnumber by, I think we've got 2.5 times as many volunteers in the heritage sector than full-time employees. So this is a sector that is incredibly reliant on volunteers for delivery of their day-to-day work.
Just out of interest on it, is there any sort of stats or analysis on what their background is, like the diversity of it and age profile? Like, I'd be really interested to know, like, who, you know, is coming forward to volunteer and any barriers that there might be in different parts of society to any of it for whatever reason. I'm thinking particularly of class, really.
Yeah, I think that I don't have the stats here, but I think we can come back and see if there's anything we've got from the relevant teams in DCMS. But I think that clearly if people are economically able to take the time to volunteer, I suspect it's probably slightly more age focused than other things, but you obviously have to be able to afford to have the time to do that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Annalise. Ruben.
Yeah, thanks. Just wanted to ask about how you would help sort of cultural venues that might not be architecturally significant, but they are vital as a community asset sort of thing. I mean, I know there is the asset of community value status, but as an MP, I found that we had it with the pub, for example, the Goldsmiths Arms. We had that listed under that scheme, but it just kind of staved it off for a year, and then the developers came, and that pub, which was a coaching inn from 1700s or something, is no more, and it's a block of flats there. So just how could you strengthen that?
In terms of the listing?
Saving things, because, I mean, there are cases where I think it's a quite weak thing. I think any constituency MP who's dealt with this status would know that it just gives people false hope. They're making a petition, they want to save this thing, and I don't think enough credence is given to the community value of these.
Well, I'd
venues.
hope that the community right to buy would play a significant part in that, which is coming on stream in the near future.
Do you need megabucks to buy it out?
Well, I think if they've got a particular length of time to find the funding for it. I don't know if
I think one of the specific changes is introducing an independent evaluation process to ensure a fair price for both the asset owner and the communities. So that is a change that is being considered as part of the legislation.
I mean, I was at the Hammersmith Society last night, and there, the Eventim Apollo is thriving, but that's because they've got megabucks sponsors who can underwrite that, whereas the Bush Hall, they were in here talking to our committee before the election when we had a venues roundtable. They really struggled. I think it was a huge fundraising effort from the community. So if you don't have that sugar daddy, is there any way you can help protect venues?
So, I mean, some of the arts venues would also be able to access money through the Arts Council, so it's quite difficult to generalise where there'd be different pots of money for these organisations.
Okay, so maybe if someone can send a comprehensive if this, do that, or whatever, because for us, it'd be good for us to have that information at our fingertips when we've got these venues. And then just the last one I wanted to ask you is about the UNESCO version of these things. So they have the intangible cultural heritage listing. Just wondered what the government position is on that, because it's a relatively new status. I think it's 20th century. And some of the things, so this is for not bricks and mortar, but for cultural interest. And some of the things that have been granted that status include the baguette in France. It's such a sort of cultural thing, and Berlin techno. So I just wondered what your opinion is on this, and if there was a bid to protect, say, for example, grime music, would the government be supportive of such an initiative?
So we've currently got a consultation on the list, our own list in the UK. I think each component nation in the UK will have their own list, and then it will sort of be a UK-wide list, and it's around living heritage and what makes our communities and groups and places special. So I think it's not up to me to go through lists and say I like grime music, I don't like grime music, and so forth. We've got expert groups that are going to be looking at each of the applications on different themes. So, but I think it's a hugely exciting opportunity to make sure we monitor and maintain an understanding of what living heritage people value in this country. And it might be anything from grime music through to Highland dancing, to cheese rolling, to whatever our equivalent of the baguette is.
The one that's always...
Yeah. But it's a making of the baguette rather than the baguette itself, I'd have to say. So I think there's a whole range of things, and what we're doing in the first instance is asking people to nominate things that they care about, and then sort of later in the year we hope to be able to publish the outcome, and then actually have an understanding of what people see as our living heritage and what people value. And if I can just make a plea, I think the consultation is still open, and we're really keen for people to put things forward. And I know a number of MPs from sort of on a cross-party basis have been encouraging people locally to put in their local traditions as well as the sort of more nationally recognised ones.
The one always cited is Morris dancing, but I know there is a campaign for grime. I'll be meeting them tomorrow, so I'll convey...
Well, we'd very much welcome...
if I can say the Minister is supportive, they would love that.
But you can say I'm encouraging them to put in the application. I'm not the person that decides what goes on the list, but I think it is about living heritage, and in that sense, that feels very much like part of our living heritage. And
Liverpool had its UNESCO status taken away. Mm-hmm. Isn't that concerning? I heard somebody said that it's political, and yeah, I mean, it may be Everton that did that, but just
to do the football ground, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I also heard that, I don't know if that's just rumours, that it's a post-Brexit climate and they don't like us having all these things.
I think that's probably an oversimplification. I wasn't the Heritage Minister when that happened. I think we're very keen. We're very keen to work with UNESCO to make sure that our incredible, rich heritage in this country continues to be recognised as world-class heritage.
Okay, I mean, yeah, just last plea, just I think when these things are read out, Earl's Court, that was another one that came up at the Hammersmith Society, that's had huge gigs in the past. It was an enormodrome of a venue. But the new Earl's Court, it will just have a community room that's not like for like. So it would be nice if we could save these iconic spaces. Same with that pub, actually, the Goldsmith Arms. They said you can have a community room, but, you know, it's not big enough to swing a cat in, and it's not the same as what we lost. But thank you.
Very good. I vote for a chip butty.
Maybe. Oh yeah, no, that would. I mean, I think
Fred Marsbar.
But it's the making of the chip butty that is the living heritage, not the chip butty itself.
Maybe it's just because it's lunchtime.
Insert chip.
Finally, Damien.
Thank you. So can I just clarify something, Fazima, that you said a moment ago on the assets, community value, and is it community right to buy? Yeah. So you were talking about an innovation which was some sort of new regulator who would determine a fair price.
Independent valuation.
But so what does that mean in practice? Does that mean there could be another bid, a commercial bid, which is higher than our independent valuer has come up with? Because I mean, the thing with Rupert's right. Sometimes it is frustrating for community groups because assets community value is a stay of execution effectively, and saying, can you match this commercial bid? And ultimately, somebody owns the property, and in a free society, has a right to recoup the value. So what is the practical effect of this independent valuer? Do they cut through that process and say, no, we think this community group should be able to buy it for this amount of money, even if there's somebody else who's offering potentially a higher amount?
I think we'd need to be able to write to you on the detail of how that would work in practice.
That's fair enough, thank you. And the other thing I wanted to ask about is to come back to the famous 670,000, which I think is sticking in all of our minds from today. It would be really helpful, and again, this might be something to do by follow-up in writing, to know any breakdown, any segmentation there is of that 670,000, but particularly, and you might know the answer to this right now, how much of that is in the publicly owned estate?
I'll endeavour to write to you on that. Some of it will be presumably in the publicly owned estate, but I'm not sure what that would comprise of. But it's historic England figures, so we'll get a sense of the breakdown from them.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. I had one stat, but
right. Why don't you give
it
was
that 300 of those are long-term vacant historic dwellings, but as the Minister said, we'll write to you with more detail on that. I can't speak to the public estate, but Mark might be able to.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you for your time today. Were there any final messages that you wanted to leave us with, or have we drained the well in terms of your expertise on this issue?
I don't think I've got anything else to add. I am looking forward to seeing the recommendations though, and I think that we have got an incredible opportunity to sort of improve where we are with the historic heritage building stock, and I think we're just really keen to hear the committee's recommendations and hopefully be able to take some of them forward.
Thank you very much. Mark?
One really small point, if I may, just we didn't touch on it in terms of the capability and skills, but one of the things that we're trying to do when we employ contractors around the heritage estate around government is make sure that in the choice that we make around contractors, there is a social value element, and we're using that to try and trigger some sustainable training programs, apprenticeships, and so on for those buildings. So it's a small part, but we're trying to get smarter in terms of how we specify the work to be done and the requirements that we need to do.
In the sense that you employ local builders and you specify that they should take on local apprentices and develop,
Indeed,
skills and
exactly
that sort of thing.
right.
Interesting. Okay, that's an interesting line of thought. Thank you very much for that. That's everything that we have for you today. Thank you very much for all your time. This brings this session to an end, but also this inquiry to an end, and we'll now be putting our heads together to come up with some cunning recommendations that we think would potentially really make a difference in this space. So we're grateful for your input today. Order.
We're